Greetings, Culture Warriors. It is I, Jeff Vieira, author of Culture is Everything, and your host for this latest dispatch from the front. Interesting story for you today. This is originally from Forbes. It's an Associated Press story. If COVID-19 isn't a big threat to the average airline passenger, but no airline bothers to tell the story, does it make any noise? If every airline in the United States joined together in advertising that the average person has only about a 0.013% chance of getting, not dying from, just getting, COVID-19 from traveling aboard a commercial airliner in which every seat is filled, would that be enough to get you to fly again? After all, the reverse of that number translates into a 99.987% chance that you won't catch COVID-19 on such a flight. Compared with a lot of other risky and not so risky things people do all the time, catching COVID-19 from flying on a full plane a day is not very likely at all. In fact, statistically speaking, it's only a tiny bit less likely that the average person being killed by commercial fireworks or by a falling meteorite. And neither of those come close to qualifying as a common cause of death. Indeed, the average person's chances of being killed, not just involved in but actually dying from a car crash, are much, much higher, about 1 in 103 every time you get in one. Yet few people give a second thought to getting into a vehicle to drive or ride somewhere. And it's likely safer to fly now than doing a lot of things in public that many Americans are doing regularly once again, like shopping in food stores, eating in restaurants, going into their offices to work, and gathering in groups of 10 or more. Yet neither individual airlines nor their Washington lobby group, Airlines for America, are paying to advertise that message. If they're trying to place well-argued pieces on the op-ed pages of the nation's biggest and most influential newspapers, and there's no evidence that they are, they're being remarkably unsuccessful, especially for a group that can normally get an op-ed in the New York Times by calling up and telling the editor that the piece already is in his or her inbox. And with only a couple of modest exceptions, they're not even getting their CEOs on the big national radio, TV, and cable talk shows, when such programs perpetually are begging to host big-name corporate leaders. Perhaps most startlingly, the industry is not even making the minimum expected effort, which would be to enlist a friendly third-party expert or former government officials to write an op-ed in support of carriers' efforts to keep their planes disease-free. Instead, the leaders of most U.S. carriers seem content to let Americans' understandable but emotionally driven and often exaggerated fears of a serious disease go unchecked. Changing minds on such matters isn't easy, of course, but it's not impossible. Yet it will never happen if they don't at least start trying. Yes, the airlines will have to be careful and smart about what and how they communicate now with the public. Thanks to the use of mathematical formulas and their application to the statistical probabilities that few people really understand, it's not hard to make folks look and feel silly when it comes to what risks they fret over versus the risks they ignore. So any communications that come off as belittling of consumers will backfire on the carriers. But there are ways to get the message out that flying and traveling is not nearly as dangerous as most people currently feel that it is. Data used appropriately can convince some, though not all, consumers that not every activity that they're avoiding right now, like, well, the plague, actually is an activity that needs to be avoided. And in the case of COVID-19, that's especially true if people follow the widely promulgated hygiene practices aimed at limiting the spread of COVID-19, wearing a mask, frequent washing of hands with soap, or the use of disinfectant gels, social distancing, and more. Carriers also need to show sensitivity by communicating effectively that while flying is much more safe than most people now believe, for those at elevated levels of risk because of their age and or underlying health issues, it's still a good idea not to fly yet. In fact, they can and should communicate that if all air travelers follow the recommended hygiene practices and that U.S. airlines actually do as thorough a job of cleaning and disinfecting their planes as they now claim they do, there would be an even smaller chance that the average person would contract the disease on a commercial flight, at least statistically speaking. Now, travelers may catch COVID-19 in the taxi or Uber car on the way to the airport, standing in the security screening line, from the checkout counter at the airport coffee shop, from stale air in the jet bridge, from the handle of their own suitcase in the baggage claim, in their rental car, or from their hotel room. Airlines can't guarantee what they can't control. Still, chances are quite high that consumers who follow the hygiene rules and take all proper precautions won't get COVID-19 on a plane. Yet, that's a story that airlines today, who are starving for revenue and still racking up daily losses of $25 to $60 million, aren't doing much to tell. You'd think that such companies would be filling every commercial break on television with ads, plastering the side of city buses and freeway billboards with ads, flooding folks' inboxes with digital messages, and appearing on every cable news talk show in America trying to get out the message. But they aren't. Well, I actually think Delta is doing a fairly good job of telling people how they clean their planes, says Ken Luce, founder and managing partner of Boutique LDWW Group, a boutique marketing and public relations firm in Dallas. If I were going to travel, and I'm not right now, I'd be comforted by that. But there are other pieces to the story, like the air filtration systems that change out 100% of the cabin's air every 2 or 3 minutes, and other practices that carriers could be telling consumers about. They could be talking about their vital role in the economy. But for some reason or another, none of them are, added Luce. Previously, as a senior executive at 2 of the nation's largest public relations firms, he advised several of the nation's largest carriers. The biggest question for consumers now, he says, is, do I trust who I'm flying with? But the carriers are being all but silent. They're communicating digitally with their frequent flyers, at least their higher mileage frequent flyers, but I don't know that they're doing that very effectively. This is not a time to lose your voice, but they have. Why is that? Could it be that the top leaders at America's big airlines know deep in their hearts that their own customers, including some of their very best and most loyal customers, don't trust them, and that many don't even like them? For the better part of 2 decades now, U.S. airlines have been taking things away from their customers. They took away hot meals in flight for the vast majority of the customers, and gave some, but not all of them, stale, bland sandwiches instead. Then they started making those customers pay for those stale, bland sandwiches, at well above street level prices, mind you. They took away free checked bags for most ordinary travelers, and made even their best customers pay if they wanted to check a second bag. They changed their frequent flyer program rules to award many travelers fewer mileage points for their travel than others, or to require more mileage points to claim that free trip they were promised when they sign up, or both. Some began charging to book a flight online. Others charged a fee if the flight wasn't booked online. And when people stopped buying those stale, bland sandwiches, they just took away the sandwiches altogether. They also took away 2, 3, sometimes even 4 or more inches of legroom in order to put in a couple more rows of seats. Thus, consumers got the clear message that their comfort was a lot less important than the airline's ability to put a whopping 12 more seats on the narrow-body planes used on most domestic flights. And the airlines made sure to tell their customers that they should be happy about it, because that's how they were able to keep fare prices down, even as they reached a new era of unprecedented profitability. When travelers complained about old and poor quality selections of programs on carrier seatback entertainment systems, some carriers solved that problem by taking away the seatback entertainment systems. And when some carriers decided they needed still more space to add another row or 2 of seats, they took much of the padding out of their narrow and too close seats to come up with a slim line design for seating, both in the cabin and in the lavatories. One carrier actually argued that people should be happy with a 24-inch wide restroom, because they did tests and most people can actually do what needs to be done in there. This in a nation where the average man weighs about 200 pounds and wears a size 42 suit coat. So sadly, this predicament is not the unexpected result of COVID-19's recent arrival. It is the result of decades of purposeful management decisions across the industry that made customers and customer service appear to be low priorities. Indeed, Luce worries that unlike cruise lines, which while shut down entirely now know that their very loyal hardcore cruising fans will be right back on board as soon as the ships get government permission to set sail again, airlines' passenger traffic recovery will be slower than the recovery of other parts of the economy. Certainly, there will be some initial signs of pent-up demand for air travel, but he says consumers already peeved at the airlines for the way they've been treated over the last 20 years may be slow to return to their former frequent flying ways. Lou says that U.S. carriers, having for so long now made their disdain for their customers abundantly clear, no longer have any standing with the public. There is no well of consumer goodwill from which U.S. carriers can draw in order to convince even their very best customers to fly again with the same vigor and frequency as before. Ultimately, it goes back to a leadership problem, not just now, but for a number of years across most of the industry, Lou said. In pursuit of other goals like market share, survival in the bad times, getting through bankruptcy and mergers, and in the recent years raking in record profits, they've lost sight of who their customers are and how to talk to them. As a result, their customers don't trust them anymore. Still, that's no excuse for not even trying to communicate a complex, nuanced, and important message that customers need to be hearing right now, and that even more so, airlines need to be preaching. Okay, so an awful lot to dissect in that article. Thank you for bearing with me through the reading of it. But from a cultural and values perspective, I like to hit on a couple of things. Number one, I would add an additional hypothesis to why the airlines are not out there communicating the facts regarding the probability of catching COVID-19 on an airplane. And that is that they are well aware that many of their customers are a bunch of Karens, a bunch of scolds, a bunch of people who are so terrorized and irrational about this virus that were the airlines to put that information out, they would accuse them of being indifferent to it, despite the fact that they're taking enormous precautions within the aircraft and at the gate, at the counter, in order to keep people from catching what for the vast majority of us is no more than a bad cold. So they know that there is a penalty to be paid for speaking the truth. They know, because they're headquartered in many of these blue states, how vicious the government can be in response. The airlines are a heavily regulated industry. If you cross the wrong people, well, then your next merger doesn't go through. Well, then you don't get the bailout that they're all waiting on, because similar to 9/11, they have a disaster that has gutted their industry. So the smarter thing to do is shut up and take it and wait for the checks to show up. And that's what they're doing. Now, it is absolutely true that the airlines as a whole have mistreated their customers abysmally. There's another cultural factor, though, that should be weighed in here. And that's that through this pandemic, through these lockdowns, we've learned just how much work can be done with people remote. I used to travel a lot for business because there was a feeling that you needed to be physically on site to accomplish what needed to be accomplished. Now, the fact is I thought that the travel was more than what was strictly necessary for that, but that's fine. There's a perception that had to be dealt with, and so you go. I think much of our business travel today is like that. So when travel becomes too much of a hassle, and when you don't have to take it, and when you have any excuse not to travel, why wouldn't people take advantage of that? I think that's exactly what they've done. It is generally a miserable experience. And so people avoid the miserable experience. And if they really want travel to come back in abundance, well, then they've got to do something to make that experience a little less miserable. Midwest Express used to operate out of Milwaukee. And when back in my days of working for GE, I had a project which was involved traveling to Charlotte, North Carolina. And that was one of the cities the Midwest Express serviced. Midwest Express was known for the fact that all of their seats were business class seats. You would eat meals with actual silverware, with cloth napkins. You would get a meal. They would bake cookies, and you would get a fresh baked cookie on your flight. And in addition to that, they were unfailingly polite. It was a pleasant experience all the way around. Their attitude was that they treated everyone as though they were first class. Now, that model eventually got subsumed. They were acquired by somebody or somewhere or whatever. But the bottom line of it is that whenever people could fly Midwest Express, they did, because it was so pleasant. When I was back and forth to Asia, we used to really privilege flying Cathay Pacific, because when you flew Cathay Pacific, even in coach, you were treated very well. They would bring you slippers on those long overnight flights. They would bring you a blanket. They would bring you a blindfold so that you could shut out the light. You would get a hot towel so that you could clean off the grime from travel. Of course, you were given meals. Chinese meals, but they were wonderful. And when you got to Hong Kong, which was their hub, after flying for, say, 16 hours, you would be able to get into a lounge that every passenger had access to, and you could change clothes. You could take a shower. It was wonderful, especially with such a long flight and the dealing with the jet lag and that sort of stuff. It was wonderful. So Cathay Pacific used to be one that we would fly. I had to make that flight over to Asia on Delta. It was hell on earth. The toilets overflow. Just an absolutely miserable experience being treated as flying cattle on a long jag like that. So if the airlines want to get back to those glory days of profitability, well, there's one way to do it, and that's to offer people a better experience so that they're willing to pay more. We'll see if they're wise enough to do that. There's not a lot of courage going on in their community right now. For whatever reason, they're all hiding in their bunkers, and there's going to be another round of cursing the airlines as soon as the inevitable bailout happens. But if just one airline would actually have the guts to go out and try and make things a little bit better, I'm sure they could pick up some pretty loyal customers for the duration. Anyway, that's my takeaway from this one. Have a great day.